In the fall of 1859, 6 powerful men vanished from a Louisiana plantation in a single night. No rebellion was reported. No weapons were found. No suspects were ever charged. What remained were locked doors, overturned chairs, and a sound witnesses would later struggle to describe: a low, persistent hum. By morning, the plantation was silent. By the end of the week, it was abandoned, and within months, the story was quietly buried. Because what happened that night did not fit the version of history anyone wanted remembered. This was not a slave uprising. This was not an accident. This was not chaos. It was deliberate. It was patient. And it was carried out by a woman the records barely mention. Her name, at least the name she was given, was Eleanor. An enslaved woman, a quiet worker, someone everyone believed they understood. They were wrong. This is not a story about revenge. It is a story about what happens when cruelty is protected by law, when silence is mistaken for submission, and when nature becomes the only courtroom left. This is Eleanor of the Bayou.
Louisiana's Bayou country in the 1850s was not a place of sudden violence. It was a place of waiting. Heat pressed down like a weight. Time moved slowly, and silence meant survival. Plantations rose out of marshland like fortresses, surrounded by water, reeds, and thick forests that swallowed sound. These estates depended not only on forced labor, but on isolation. What happened there stayed there. The land was fertile, the air was heavy, and the rules were clear. White men owned the land. They owned the law, and they owned the people who worked beneath them. At one such plantation, far from cities, far from scrutiny, Eleanor lived and labored. She worked close to the main house, not in the fields. That alone made her visible and vulnerable. She tended storage rooms, watched animals, moved quietly between buildings, and because she spoke little, people assumed she thought little. This was the first mistake. Because plantations were not just built on cotton and wealth, they were built on not looking too closely.
Eleanor was in her early 30s when the year 1859 began. Tall, strong, careful with her movements. She had been born enslaved, but her mother had not. Her mother came from across the Atlantic, carrying knowledge that did not translate neatly into plantation life. Knowledge about plants, about animals, about patience. Before she died, she taught Eleanor 2 things that mattered most. First, never reveal everything you know. Second, nature listens longer than people do. Eleanor learned to observe. She learned which creatures panicked and which endured, which sounds warned and which summoned, which silences kept you alive. By the time she was assigned to work near food stores and livestock, she already understood something the plantation owners did not. Control does not come from force alone. It comes from understanding behavior. And Eleanor understood it very well.
The men who ruled the plantation saw themselves as respectable, church-going, educated, protected by law and custom. They were fathers, officials, guests welcomed with open doors and full glasses. They believed order was natural, that hierarchy was ordained, that some people existed only to be used. What they did not believe was that an enslaved woman could be watching them with calculation instead of fear. They mistook Eleanor's silence for acceptance. They mistook her stillness for emptiness. And in doing so, they gave her something more valuable than freedom. They gave her access. What happened next was never written plainly. It exists only in fragments, in missing names,
in censored reports, in testimonies that stop short. But this much is clear. In the spring of that year, something began happening to Eleanor that would not end quickly. It repeated. It followed patterns. It involved men who expected obedience and silence. And Eleanor gave them exactly that. Outwardly. Inwardly, she began to count. Days, voices, footsteps, smells. She learned who drank the most, who slept the deepest, who panicked when surprised. And while the plantation moved through its routines, meals, work, prayers, Eleanor's sense of time changed. It no longer moved forward. It coiled, waiting. Because Eleanor was not preparing to run, she was preparing for something else entirely. And when the bees began to gather, no one noticed. The bayou was alive with sound long before anyone paid attention to it. Insects moved through the air in shifting patterns. Water insects skimmed the surface of slow-moving canals, and bees everywhere worked the edges of the plantation. They nested in hollow trees, under eaves, inside abandoned sheds no one used anymore. Most people avoided them. Eleanor did not. She had been trusted with animals before, chickens, goats, storage pests. So when she was seen calmly relocating hives away from work areas, no one questioned it. In fact, she was praised. Bees were dangerous. Bees disrupted order. Bees caused panic. But Eleanor handled them without fear. She understood something most people didn't. Bees do not attack without reason. They respond to vibration, to breath, to threat. They respond to disruption. And Eleanor had begun to understand how disruption worked. Months passed. To everyone else, Eleanor seemed smaller somehow, quieter, more compliant. She arrived when summoned. She completed her work without delay. She never raised her voice. The men mistook this for success. They believed time had done its work. But time was doing Eleanor's work instead. She mapped routines in her mind. Which doors were locked at night? Which buildings echoed? Which places swallowed sound? She learned how far a scream traveled in damp air. She noticed how men walked when drunk, how they laughed louder, how they listened less. And all the while, the bees multiplied. No one counted them. No one thought to. Eleanor never said her plan aloud. Not to herself, not to anyone else. Because once spoken, a plan can be interrupted. Instead, she practiced. She practiced moving through darkness without light. She practiced holding still while sound passed around her. She practiced waiting. She also practiced something else. Stillness. The kind that unnerves people. The kind that makes men uncomfortable without knowing why. She learned how close she could stand without being noticed. How long she could remain unseen even when she was present. This was not rebellion. This was preparation. And by the time the air grew cooler and the fog returned to the bayou, Eleanor no longer thought of herself as trapped. She thought of herself as positioned. The gathering was not unusual. Men arrived with rifles, liquor, and confidence. They had hunted that day. They had eaten well. By nightfall, voices grew louder. Laughter spilled from the main house, drifting across the yard and dissolving into fog. Lanterns were lit, glasses refilled, boots removed. No one noticed Eleanor moving between buildings. No one questioned why she carried covered baskets or why certain doors were closed that were usually left open. The Bayou fog thickened, folding the plantation inward on itself. Sound became uncertain. Distance became deceptive. And somewhere, just at the edge of hearing, the hum began to rise. The first sound that caused concern was not a scream. It was confusion. A chair scraped. Footsteps stopped abruptly. A voice called out and received no answer. Then another sound. Sharper. Closer. The hum. Men began opening doors they had never needed to lock, calling names that did not respond. No one saw Eleanor, but everyone felt something was wrong, because fear does not announce itself loudly at first. It arrives as hesitation, as the sense that the night is no longer obeying you. And when the first man ran, not away, but blindly, the hum followed. By the time anyone understood that this was not an accident, that this was not nature behaving randomly, it was already too late. Because Eleanor had not released chaos, she had released order, an order that answered only to her. Power does not disappear all at once. It fractures. Men who had spent their lives giving orders now shouted questions no one answered. Lantern light shook in unsteady hands. Doors were opened, then shut again. Names were called into darkness that refused to respond. Somewhere nearby, the hum surged, not loud, not violent, but relentless. The men tried to regroup. They always did. They told themselves this was confusion, that daylight would fix it, that authority would reassert itself. But authority only works when others believe in it, and that night, belief was gone. One by one, confidence gave way to panic. And panic does not follow hierarchy. It scatters. At some point, every man on the property understood the same thing. This was intentional. This was not chance. This was not nature misbehaving. Someone had planned this. Someone who knew where to stand, where to wait, when to move. And the most terrifying realization of all, the person responsible was not afraid of them. Because fear leaves traces, hesitation, noise. What moved through the plantation that night left neither, only reaction. By the time the first body was found, no one screamed. They stared, because whatever had happened did not resemble violence they recognized. There were no gunshots, no knives, no signs of struggle they could name. Only the aftermath of panic meeting inevitability. Morning came slowly. Fog lifted in pieces. Sunlight revealed shapes people wished it wouldn't. Men who had arrived together were gone, or unrecognizable. Buildings stood open. Lanterns burned out. Silence replaced the hum. By mid-morning, word spread. By afternoon, riders were sent. And by evening, officials arrived with notebooks that would later contain very little. Questions were asked. But not all questions are meant to be answered, especially when the answers threaten the structure asking them. The reports would later say, cause undetermined, unclear circumstances, suspected incident. They would not say how. They would not say why. And they would never say who. When the search began, Eleanor was already gone. Her cabin stood empty, her belongings left behind. No signs of struggle, no tracks anyone could agree on. Some claimed she fled in fear. Others whispered something else.
that she had walked away calmly, as if she had already finished her work. The enslaved people of plantation vanished soon after. Some were found weeks later on distant roads. Others were never seen again. No one ever testified, because no one wanted to explain how one woman had undone what law and violence had built. History did what it often does best. It simplified. The plantation was labeled cursed. The incident became rumor. The details faded. Maps changed. Records disappeared. Land passed to new owners who avoided questions. Eleanor's name survived only in fragments, in whispers, in warnings, in stories told quietly to children near the water. Stories about a woman who never raised her voice, who never asked permission, who waited. And when the world finally gave her no choice, she answered in a language no one could silence. The bayou returned to stillness, but the fear did not. History did what it often does best. It simplified. The plantation was labeled cursed. The incident became rumor. The details faded. Maps changed. Records disappeared. Land passed to new owners who avoided questions. Eleanor's name survived only in fragments, in whispers, in warnings, in stories told quietly to children near the water. Stories about a woman who never raised her voice, who never asked permission, who waited. And when the world finally gave her no choice, she answered in a language no one could silence. The bayou returned to stillness, but the fear did not. No official record explains how Eleanor left the bayou. There are no warrants, no chase reports, no capture, only absence. Some believed she followed the river north, moving at night, resting during the day. Others claimed she vanished into communities that already knew how to hide people the law refused to protect. What is known is this: after that night, the plantation never functioned again. Labor stopped, ownership fractured, and people who had once been treated as property were suddenly gone. Eleanor did not leave alone. Whether by planning or by consequence, others followed. Freedom, once imagined, became contagious. Years later, a woman with Eleanor's description appeared in the north, under a different name. She worked quietly, helped the sick, delivered children. Those who knew her said she disliked crowds, disliked loud voices, disliked men who believed the world belonged to them. She never spoke publicly about Louisiana, but when asked where she came from, she would sometimes pause and say, "From a place that no longer exists." Those closest to her noticed something else. She was never startled by insects, never swatted them away. In the South, Eleanor became something else, not a person, a warning. Planters spoke of her in lowered voices. Insurance costs rose. Rules tightened. Not because they feared rebellion, but because they feared retaliation. The idea that silence could be planning, that obedience could be temporary, that the people they believed powerless were watching, remembering, waiting. They feared Eleanor not because of what she did, but because of what she proved was possible. Every generation believes it has moved beyond the injustices of the last. And yet, the roads still carry us. The water still reaches us. The systems still serve us, quietly.
Modern historians who stumble across Isaac Brown's traces face a dilemma. If they pursue the truth fully, they risk dismantling comforting narratives. If they ignore it, they become part of the silence that preserved the lie. There is no dramatic revelation waiting in an archive, no final document signed with his name, no moment where history confesses. Instead, there is only a pattern of brilliance emerging where it was forbidden, a pattern of ideas traveling farther than their creators, a pattern of nations benefiting while refusing to remember. Isaac Brown does not haunt America because of how he lived. He haunts it because of how easily he was absorbed and erased, and because that ease has never fully disappeared. Eleanor of the Bayou was not born violent. She was made by laws that denied her protection, by men who mistook access for entitlement, by a world that offered her no court, no witness, no justice. So she found another way. And if her story unsettles you, it should. Because it is not only a story about the past. It is a story about power, about silence, about what people become when every door to justice is locked. Eleanor did not ask to be remembered. But history does not forget consequences. It only delays them. Some nights in the bayou, when the air is still and the water barely moves, people swear they can hear it again. Not a scream, not a warning, just a low, steady hum, reminding anyone who listens that silence is not the same as surrender.